We're looking at a moral argument for the existence of God, and we're looking at the version proposed by William Lane Craig. And let's get right to the argument. No need for setup here. Let's consider this first premise. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now, obviously, he's going to spend some time defending this, so we'll look at his defense later, but let's move on with the argument. Objective moral values and duties do exist, and if those two premises are true, we have a valid argument structure, and we would conclude that God exists. So that's the argument, very simple form, modus tollens, valid structure. Obviously, the merits of the argument depend on the truth of its premises. So, some clarifications to consider. We're talking about moral values and duties. So let's make sure that we're clear on those concepts. Values have to do with moral worth, whether something is good or bad. And so sometimes we speak of moral values when we make moral judgments, like we say suffering and injustice is bad. Then we're saying that the outcome is bad. Typically, that's what we're talking about with values. We're talking about an outcome, not always, but typically. Or we say something like receiving help in a time of need, that is a good thing. Again, we're talking about the outcome there. Duties are different, okay? So duties have to do with obligations, whether something is right or wrong. And we can make evaluative statements, right? Talk about values without talking about obligations or duties. So we can say something like, it would be morally good for someone to spend a full year teaching children in Haiti, or helping the homeless in San Francisco, or volunteering with a prison reading program in Chicago. Those would be of moral worth, but that doesn't mean you're obligated to do that for the next year. Moral duties are about what we are obligated to do, what we ought to do, or often what we ought not to do. So we say things like, she shouldn't gossip so much about her friends, or he ought to treat her with more respect, right? Those are obligations or duties that we have. And then finally, objective. Objective means that these are independent of anybody's opinion. So it doesn't matter what people think, these values and duties still exist, right? And that's the idea. And so we have our argument. If God doesn't exist, then these kinds of moral values and duties do not exist. These do in fact exist, therefore God exists. All right, what's the defense of that first premise? Okay, so if there is no God, and human behavior is merely a product of evolution, and that's really the alternative if there isn't a God, and this product or behavior is something that is for survival, right? Then there doesn't seem to be any moral value, argues Craig, right? And if atheistic naturalism is true, then all that exists is under the realm of science. Everything we investigate would be under the realm of science. Now, I think it would be very reasonable to qualify that a little bit more. But Craig, focusing on that first idea that all of our behavior is related to evolutionary processes leading to survival and propagation, where is moral value in that, right? Science certainly doesn't investigate value, only behavior. And so if you are an atheistic naturalist who thinks that science is what covers everything that exists, well, it's not going to cover values, moral obligations. And so if God doesn't exist, it would look like you wouldn't have those things. All right, another way of defending this first premise is to put it into the form of a question, right? If there isn't a God, from where do obligations arise? Right? Where do they come from? And again, thinking about there not being a God, you may say something like rape isn't biologically advantageous, or it's socially taboo, so it may not be good for you to rape someone because you're going to be an outcast. But science alone can't show us that it's morally wrong, right? So Craig asked this question, on what basis is rape morally wrong? Now, he's not asking about things like, obviously, it harms another person. Clearly, someone is severely harmed here. Okay, so he's not questioning that. But what provides the reason why we should avoid that harm is the issue. And Craig claims that there are no good bases other than the existence of God that provide for these objective moral values and duties. That's the only reason we should try to not harm other people, right? And harming other people is wrong, especially in severe cases like rape. Okay, a clarification here. Note that the claim, he is not claiming about anything for people who don't believe in God. Okay, so put it this way, right? The claim has nothing to do with whether someone believes that God exists or not. He's not saying all atheists are immoral. Make that clear. So an atheist can be moral. An atheist can recognize moral obligations, according to Craig, but the atheist still not recognize the origin, the source of those moral obligations. So an atheist might recognize that moral obligations exist, might recognize that it is morally wrong to commit murder, but not be aware of where the obligations come from. So consider a no trespassing sign. Suppose you're walking through a forest and you come to an open area that's gated, and there's a sign on it that says no trespassing. I've had this experience before. Now, you can recognize that there's an obligation and it's got some authority on you, that you're obligated not to go beyond that gate without having any idea about the source of that authority. You don't know whose land it is or who put up the sign or who's claiming that you shouldn't go on the land, but you can still recognize the authority. So Craig argues that something like that is still going on with an atheist. They recognize the authority of obligations when it comes to morality, or at least most of them do, many of them do, but not recognize where that obligation is rooted. So here's a couple objections to consider. One would be to have an atheist could say, well, I don't believe that God's the source of moral obligations and moral values, but there are Platonic moral values, a sort of Platonism, that these moral values just exist. There's really not any more explanation to it. Now, first response of Craig is he's not a Platonist, so he finds this hard to understand. He's not very sympathetic to Platonism. So even if no people existed, he asks, would that mean that justice just exists on its own? Is that the kind of thing justice is? And that seems really odd, right? If there aren't any beings that have moral obligations and moral values, they just are there, you know, in some odd space that is hard to describe. He doesn't understand that, right? Or a second response here, even if there were values without God, so even if you grant values, that there are some things that are good outcomes, some things that are bad, to exist, from where would the obligations come from? Why should I have a moral duty to be just or to be merciful or to help other people, right? Why should that have any sway on my actions, right? I'm just a product of evolution. So what I should be about is seeking pleasure and survival. What's more to life than that, right? So it's hard to explain obligations on Platonism. Okay, a second objection is to object to that first premise by what Craig calls stubborn humanism. And the idea there is, well, you don't have to have God to say that whatever contributes to human flourishing is good, and whatever takes away from human flourishing is bad. So certainly a lot of atheists would believe that. Now, Craig's response here is, well, this seems to be arbitrary. Why would humans be special? Why would humans be preferred over other animals? Or maybe there are greater beings that we should be more concerned about. Why should we not say that whatever produces flourishing for birds is the best thing, or whales, or pick your animal there? Or why not say if there are superior beings, some extraterrestrials that are super intelligent and they want to come on and take over Earth, why wouldn't we say, yeah, that's what they ought to do because, you know, they are more important than we are? It seems to be arbitrary, according to this Craig, on this view, to think that humans have this special place of value. Now, a modification to this approach is to say, well, whoever intentionally causes pain has done something morally wrong, because pain is something that is intrinsically bad. And this is certainly something that atheists have said, something along this line. And a response to this, again, is, well, that may have some say about values, but again, from where does the obligation not to cause pain come, right? Why think there's an obligation for anyone to not cause pain? It seems like this still doesn't have any pull on behavior. Where is that source? And Craig says, apart from God, there isn't any. So this gives us reason to think that God exists.